Let's just dive right into this explainer because the historical butterfly effect we're looking at today is honestly absolutely mind-bending. We're often taught history like it's this series of inevitable stones just perfectly laid out on a path right to the present day. But today we are going to look at how incredibly fragile those stones actually are. We're talking about how just one man surviving a sudden fever could have completely, entirely rewritten the reality, the genetics, and the culture of our modern world.
So, the crucial starting point here is a deceptively simple question, but one with just staggering implications. What if Alexander the Great didn't die in Babylon at age 32? I mean, we all know the actual history, right? He catches that mysterious fever in 323 BCE, and his generals, the Diadochi, immediately rip his fragile empire apart in these bitter, bloody civil wars. The unity shattered pretty much instantly. But imagine if he recovered. Imagine he lives another 40 years ruling well into his 70s. With his legendary, basically insatiable ambition, there is no way he just sits back to play defense. No, he would have used those 4 decades to build a colossal, unified world empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the borders of China.
And the moment he's back on his feet, that massive Macedonian war machine wouldn't miss a single beat. But here's the twist. Instead of continuing east, which, he'd spent the last decade doing, Alexander's immediate plans actually called for a massive pivot to the west. He figured the east was handled, so the west was his next great uncharted frontier. His first move was going to be circumnavigating and subjugating the Arabian Peninsula, which would set the absolute perfect stage for a full-scale Western conquest. So he wasn't even close to being done expanding. He was literally just changing directions to finish the map. His tactical game plan for this Western theater was just devastatingly methodical. First up on the chopping block, Carthage. They were the outrageously wealthy, dominant maritime power of the Mediterranean at the time. To pull off a guaranteed win against them, he planned to combine the immense naval fleets of Phoenicia and Greece into this one unstoppable armada. And once Carthage and North Africa were secured, he'd take those heavily armored, incredibly seasoned Macedonian phalanxes and march them straight up into Italy. Using sheer, overwhelming numbers, his veteran commanders, and of course his own unmatched tactical genius, he would systematically dismantle the ancient world's biggest maritime powers. Now think about the sheer scale of the butterfly effect we're talking about right here. At this exact moment in history, Rome was just a rising, relatively small regional republic. They were mostly just locked in local skirmishes with their Italian neighbors. Obviously, in our actual timeline, they rise up over centuries, spread Latin everywhere, and establish Roman law across Europe. But in Alexander's timeline, his overwhelming, world-conquering forces would have absolutely crushed those early Roman legions before they ever even had a chance to get off the ground. Rome would literally become a minor, forgotten footnote in Macedonian history. Just pause and think about that. The legal systems we use today, the way European cities are laid out, the Roman Senate, the entire Latin language, poof, gone. Completely erased from human history. So, with the Mediterranean basically transformed into a giant Macedonian lake, an aging but completely restless Alexander would have turned his eyes right back to the east and the south. He had to finish what he started. Remember, his original campaign into India only stopped because his troops were exhausted and basically mutinied. But now, we're talking about an absolute ruler with decades of consolidated power, massive new supply lines, and fresh generations of completely loyal Greco-Persian soldiers. He is definitely pushing past the Ganges River. That expansion would force a direct, absolute titan clash with the rising Nanda or Maurya empires of ancient India. That alone forever alters Asian history. Oh, and at the exact same time, he'd be funding massive expeditions down the Nile, seamlessly bringing sub-Saharan Africa into his rapidly expanding global trade network. But honestly, to truly understand Alexander's ultimate goal, we have to look past the military campaigns and the bloodshed. His grandest vision was this concept he called homonoia. It literally translates to the union of hearts between different cultures. And guys, this was a wildly radical idea for the ancient world. Greeks typically viewed anyone who wasn't Greek as, well, an uncivilized barbarian. But Alexander didn't just want to conquer people and take their taxes. He actively enforced mass intermarriages between his top generals and Eastern nobility. He heavily pushed for the blending of Greek and Persian customs right from the ground up. He was essentially trying to socially engineer a truly unified global population. If you want to grasp the sheer scale and, maybe the sheer ego of his cultural ambition, just look at this one number, 70. Throughout his campaigns, he founded over 70 cities that he simply named Alexandria. But these Alexandrias, they weren't just fortified military outposts to hold down territory. They were incredibly intentional. He designed them to be these vibrant, heavily interconnected hubs of trade, science, and philosophy spanning across 3 different continents. They were literally meant to be the circulatory system for his entire New World Order. So if you take that hominoia concept and give it 40 more years to bake, 40 years of deliberate state-sponsored cultural mixing, you end up with a highly unique global civilization. And it all rests on 3 interconnected pillars. First up, language. A single, standardized form of Coney Greek becomes the absolute universal language. We're talking trade, law, literature, from Spain all the way to India. Second, religion. Instead of completely separate Eastern and Western pantheons, we'd see this massive syncretic fusion. Greek gods actively blending with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian deities. We actually saw Greco-Buddhism flourish in Central Asia after his death in our timeline, but here, it happens on a truly global scale. And finally, science. It would be driven by unified intelligence centers sharing information without borders. And speaking of those intelligence centers, the legendary Library of Alexandria wouldn't just be a dusty repository of Greek philosophy. In this timeline, it serves as the beating heart of the empire. It would literally be translating Indian mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, and Persian statecraft into one unified scientific blueprint. Imagine that. Human knowledge wouldn't be siloed by geography or warring states or impossible translation barriers anymore. It would be rapidly, wildly accelerating through a level of global collaboration the ancient world had never seen.
Now, of course, no empire lasts forever, right? When Alexander eventually dies in his 70s, it's highly likely this massive world empire still splits apart. I mean, no single heir, no matter how capable, could realistically hold together a territory spanning 3 continents for centuries. It's just too big. But the nature of this fracture is what changes literally everything for human progress. Because of those 40 years of stabilization, it wouldn't shatter into a bunch of isolated, warring kingdoms starting entirely from scratch. No, it would break into highly advanced, deeply interconnected Greco-Eastern states. And the reason they remain so advanced is pretty straightforward: infrastructure. These splintered states still share that universal Greek language, so scholars and merchants can still communicate seamlessly from Italy to India. They share a common currency, which keeps all that vital global trade flowing without missing a beat. But most importantly, they share a unified scientific knowledge. Because of this incredibly robust, deeply ingrained infrastructure, this timeline entirely bypasses the fragmentation and technological stagnation of the European Dark Ages. Think about the massive loss of knowledge, the collapsed aqueducts, the isolated feudal societies that happened after Rome fell in our timeline. None of that happens here. Why? Because Rome never built the infrastructure that eventually collapsed. Alexander did, and he built it to be universally adaptable.
When you connect all these historical dots, it brings us to a staggering, almost sci-fi level conclusion. 1,000 years. By the time we reach the modern era, human history would have been accelerated by centuries. Think about it. Without the chaotic rise and fall of the Roman Empire and completely skipping over the centuries of regression during the Dark Ages, a globally unified scientific community all speaking the exact same universal language would likely achieve an industrial revolution and start space exploration a full 1,000 years ahead of our current timeline. Mind-blowing, right? Which leaves us with this final amazing thought to ponder. Would you even recognize our modern world today? It wouldn't be a product of Roman law or the Latin alphabet or Western European fragmentation. It would be the sprawling, deeply philosophical, heavily blended dream of a single Macedonian king who just happened to survive a fever. It really makes you wonder just how fragile the building blocks of our current reality truly are. Thanks for joining me on this explainer today. Keep asking those big questions, and I will see you next time.